Hello and welcome to this video. And where are we? We are here in Armagh in front of Tower Hill Hospital, which was the old workhouse built in the 1840s. And in order to understand what went on here, we need to put the whole workhouse story into its historical context. Why are we here in Armagh? We're here for two reasons in front of Armagh Workhouse. Because number one, the structure behind me here, as you will see as we go on through the video, is, to my knowledge anyway, the most intact of all the workhouses in Ireland. And the second reason we're here in Armagh is because Armagh Workhouse is the workhouse that I know most about. Because it was Armagh Workhouse that I researched in the early 1980s and wrote the book about. That's the second reason we're here, because it's the most intact and it's the one I know most about. But there are workhouses all over the country. Some still a little bit intact, some disappeared completely. Now, there are some misconceptions about the workhouses. Many people believe that they were built for the famine, but the workhouses were not built for the famine. The workhouses were built in 1841-42, and the famine occurred in 1845-46, so they were not built for the famine. But during the famine, they became the domicile of all the poor people in the country, and they were overflowing. So why were they built? Well, the 1830s in England ushered in the Whig Party into power on the promises of a new era of reform for the poorer classes. Before that, poverty was a crime and it carried very severe punishments. They were called vagrants, beggars, tramps, paupers, mendicants, and all over Europe there were hordes of beggars. Every country in Europe had their problems with vagrants, and it was crime and punishment. Ireland seemed to be worse than the rest of Europe, and I'll explain to you why. The Whig government created a commissioner, a royal commission for England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland to go around the country and to assess the need for poor relief. And the commissioners in Ireland reported back in 1836, and they did not recommend the workhouse system for Ireland. And why not? Because they found in Ireland such a story of destitution that the workhouse system wouldn't work in Ireland. Because these workhouses were meant to be very, very, very severe places to live in, and life inside was meant to be harsher than life outside. Now in England, Scotland and Wales it was possible to do that, but in Ireland there was no leeway. Life outside was so intolerable, it could not possibly be made any more intolerable inside. That Royal Commission reported, and here's the words they reported in their commission: a mass of filth, nakedness and misery is constantly moving about, entering every house, addressing itself to every eye and soliciting from every hand. That was the report from the Irish commissioners. And mendicity and wretchedness have become too common to be disgraceful. It is not disreputable to beg, or to appear wretchedly clothed, or to be without any of the decencies of life. That was the story in Ireland. So you can see why the workhouse system was not suitable for Ireland. But the Whig government disregarded that and went ahead with building the workhouses. The Whig government, by the way, the Whigs and the Tories in England in the 1830s, the Whigs would have been the predecessors of the present Liberal. They merged into Liberal parties, and now it's the Liberal Democrat Party. That's where the Whigs. George Nichols was the man in charge of the whole process. And here was his intention, what he wanted to see. And I quote from him: "I wish to see the poor house looked to with dread by our labouring classes, and the reproach for being an inmate of it extend downwards from father to son, from generation to generation." There was meant to be a stigma attached to this workhouse, and it was meant to be a test of poverty. Only those who were prepared to tolerate worse circumstances inside than outside would make that place their domicile. But in Ireland, there was no leeway to make it worse, as you can see. The first poor law was passed 1838, and the country was divided into poor law unions. Each union had a workhouse, and we're here in front of the Armagh workhouse. And as we take you through this video, I'm going to quote from, well, the minutes of the records of the committee meetings of the Board of Governors and from the registers. And I'm going to put together this story of the Armagh workhouse for you as I take you around the buildings here, because most of it is still intact in the background. And then, at the end of it, we're going to go into what was called the pauper's graveyard. And we're going to do a releasing ceremony. I've got Declan Quigley with me here from Anamanaska and Christine McGarry. And we're going to go in there and do a releasing ceremony in that pauper's graveyard. Because, as you know, trauma and pain and sorrow is all absorbed by the earth we walk on. And the paupers, as they were called, buried in that graveyard, would have died in extreme trauma and misery. Because when they come in here, remember, life was supposed to be so intolerable. When they come in here, children were separated from parents. There was an adult female ward, an adult male ward, and you see those at the back. And there was a young girls ward and a young boys ward. You'll see that at the back as well. Now, the other misconception is, first of all, that these were not built for the famine. The other misconception, yes, there was a lot of sorrow during the famine, but it was these workhouses that saved a lot of lives as well during the famine. Because if they hadn't been able to come in here, and they were able to come in and go out as they wanted, they weren't forced in, not like the Magdalen homes. The Magdalen homes, they had no choice, they were put in there and locked in there. These people could come in and out as they wanted. So you'll find in the registers, the numbers go up in the winter time when the weather gets worse, and they come right down in the summertime when people go out again. But some people never left, they died in here. And it's those who died in here who are buried in the pauper's graveyard at the back. And most of them would have been children. Life was very intolerable, yes. And the famine came along. And that was when the workhouses came into their own, because they're overflowed with people. And why the famine? The famine, the same blight, potato blight, hit England and America at the same time with absolutely no effect. But in Ireland here, it was devastating. And why was that? Because the Irish were dependent on the potato alone, and once that was blighted, they had nothing else, no alternative. And the sad thing is, at the same time as the Irish were suffering here from poverty and from hunger during the famine, there were grain and corn was being exported from the country. Why? Because Ireland had two problems. Number one was the awful system of absentee landlords. These landlords lived in England, not here in the country, and that meant that they had their agents here collecting rents. So all the money in Ireland for rents was going out of the country. It wasn't being recycled into the rest of the country. So there comes a stage when there is no more money left in the country. And that's what happened by 1845. There was no money. And the second scourge was subdivision. Subdivision meant that a farmer, small farmer, had maybe an acre of land. He has 4 or 5 sons. And that acre of land was divided into 4 or 5 parts, 4 or 5 pieces. In turn, they have sons again, and so that land is subdivided as they go down. That's been going on since the 1820s, since Daniel O'Connell's time. And by 1845, the land was so subdivided that you might have had as many as 20 families living off a quarter of an acre of land. And the only crop that will yield a big enough supply to feed them was the lumper potato. So when the blight hit the potato, they had nothing. And that was when they all drifted into the workhouse. Now, the workhouse registers can be questioned as well. Because say, for example, you were going into the workhouse, would you go, and knowing the stigma that was attached to it, from generation to generation, would you go to your nearest workhouse? You might not. You might go further away where nobody would know you. And would you give your right name? You might not. So, even though we've got the registers and all the minute books, how much can we rely on them? But they do paint a general picture. And that's the picture I'm going to describe to you as we work our way round the workhouse here. And eventually we'll end up in the pauper's graveyard to do our cleansing ceremony. On July the 31st, 1838, the first Poor Law for Ireland was passed by the Whig administration in England. This Act divided the country into Poor Law unions, composed of electoral divisions, which were made up of townlands. Each union was placed under the management of a board of guardians. Each union was to have a workhouse, and relief was to be limited to relief within the workhouse at the discretion of the guardians. To pay for the workhouses, a poor rate was to be levied on the property owners of each union. The board of guardians appointed a clerk to admit and record those entering, a master and matron, a medical officer, a porter, a schoolmaster and schoolmistress, a chaplain. All the specific duties, responsibilities and the salary, as decided by the Board of Guardians. George Nichols, one of the original Poor Law Commissioners, was in charge. The same George Nichols who said, "I wish to see the poorhouse looked to with dread by our labouring classes, and the reproach for being an inmate of it extend downwards from father to son." By January 1841, 4 workhouses had been opened and had 5,468 inmates. A year later, 37 workhouses were opened with 15,246 inmates. All the workhouses in England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland were built to the same specific plan. Armagh Workhouse is still intact on the outside, and we can clearly see the male adult yard, the female adult yard, the boys' yard and the girls' yard. The workhouse was plain and drab inside, with rough stone walls and bare rafters. The cost of Irish workhouses was less than the English ones, reduced even further by making the floors out of mortar rather than boards or flagstones, and instead of bedsteads, sleeping platforms, which were simply continuous raised wooden floors on either side of the dormitories or wards where the inmates slept on straw mattresses. Later, the architect Mr. Wilkinson attempted to economise even further by suggesting a wooden rail fence as a rear boundary. But here the Board of Guardians determined to have their way, and a solid stone wall was built. The inmates were to be clothed in the workhouse dress, their own clothes confiscated and purified, and then when they left again, their original clothing returned and the workhouse dress restored to the workhouse. The workhouse clothing was to be made by the inmates themselves as part of the labour required of them. The paupers were classified into various groups. First of all, males above 13 years old. Secondly, boys under 13 and above 5. Then females above 13 years old. Then girls under 13 and above 5. And lastly, children of both sexes under 5 years. And again, these were classified even further. The men were divided into aged and infirm men, able-bodied men and youths above 13 years. Then the boys under 13 and above 5, aged and infirm men, and 5 years. The inmates, or paupers as they were known, were employed breaking stones, making workhouse clothes, helping in the sick wards or the care of infants, household work, cooking, etc. The rules were strict and it was very severely regimented. The workhouse opened in 1841 and we have the registers which tell us a lot about the first inmates who entered the workhouse. We can see by the headings of the columns the information they were required to give. So the registers tell us that the paupers were given a number. They were known as pauper number 1, number 2, whatever. Here we have on the first column, number of the pauper, then the pauper's name, surname first, then the sex, male or female, then the age, and then if the pauper was an adult, whether single, married, widow or widower, and if the pauper was a child, whether such child be an orphan, as here, or a bastard, as here, or deserted by parents, as here. Whether the pauper, next one, was disabled, partially or wholly, and the description of the disability. For example, crippled, as here, disabled, deaf and dumb. The name of the wife or husband, none, 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 whatever it was, if they were single. The number of children. The observation on the pauper's condition when admitted. For example, very infirm. DO means ditto, the same, healthy, cripple, paralysed. A fine boy, very infirm, and so on. Next was the electoral division and townland in which the pauper was resident. And then the date when the pauper was admitted. And finally, the date of the pauper's death in the workhouse or discharged from the workhouse. For example, here, died in the workhouse. The rest are all discharged. The dietary for the paupers was mostly, well, completely, meal made into what was called stirabout with buttermilk, a small amount of potatoes and salt. That was for breakfast, dinner and supper. The officers, of course, were given larger quantities of that. Punishments too were very severe, and we have records of these in the minute books of the meetings of the Board of Guardians. September the 21st, 1844, 6 boys broke windows. The schoolmaster was directed to punish them with 6 stripes and deprived of milk for 3 alternate meals. And on March the 1st, 1845, a female pauper for burning a tin and threatening the nurse to break a tub of stones per day for next week. July the 19th, 1845, a 13-year-old boy to be flogged for leaving the house without permission. July the 26th, 1845, a female pauper to be exposed in school with fool's cap for breaking glass. On May the 14th, 1844, another pauper, number 2425, who absconded on the 9th of May and returned, was brought up by the master before the board. It was ordered that he be confined in the refractory ward 9 hours each day for 3 successive days. February the 14th, 1846, a female pauper to be locked up 6 hours each day for a week and get no supper for insulting the master. And so it goes on and on and on, right down through the history of the workhouse. The minute books of the Board of Guardian meetings also put a picture to these inmates for us. We get human beings here and how they were treated. For example, on October 24th, 1843, a 15-year-old boy, pauper number 676, had between 9 and 10 that morning committed suicide by strangling himself with his handkerchief in the privy of the male idiots. The boy had eaten his breakfast as usual, and a short time before he did the act, he was engaged with others in working at the pump. And the jury gave us their verdict. Died by his own hand whilst labouring under temporary derangement. September the 13th, 1845. We have a female, 11-year-old, number 3406. Applied to go and live with Mr. Hamilton in place of Mary Jane Gray, who had returned to the workhouse rather than live in the country. The shoes and stockings of Mary Jane were to be given now to Abby Leckie. And the guardians told her that if at the end of 3 months her master would bring her before them and give her a good character, they would make her some little present, a book or an article of dress, by way of encouraging her to maintain a good character. And if we look at the registers and the numbers of people coming into Armagh Workhouse, we can see a very clear pattern developing. We need to remember these workhouses were built for able-bodied people who would come in and work, not for disabled, but we see a very clear pattern developing here. First of all, the 1842 register. And we can see the numbers here. January, 285 came in. And we can see clearly too, yes, August, September, October, the numbers going down after the summer. But let's analyse this figure here, 285, in January 1840. Of these 285 for January, 52 were men, and of those 52, 20 were widowers. Women, 99, 28 of those were widows. 134 children under 15 years. And of these 134 children, 2 were under, and 114 were between 2 and 15 years. What were they registered as? Of these 114, 27 were orphaned or deserted. 25 were fatherless. 2 were termed bastards. These are human beings we're talking about. Of these 52 men, 31 or 60% were able-bodied. 21 were disabled, old age, idiotic, etc. So the able-bodied, which is what the workhouses were built for, were 60% there. Now of these 31 able-bodied men, 3 were weavers, 10 were labourers, 10 had no occupation, 1 was a servant, 1 a shoemaker, 1 a shopkeeper, 1 a painter, 1 a hatter, making hats, and learning carpentry trade, 1. Now let's look at the deaths here. Of those 285 for January total, 41 died before 1847. Of these 41 deaths, 7 were under 2 years and 7 were between 2 and 6 years. And of these 14 child deaths, 11 were reported as healthy when they entered the workhouse, 2 reported as delicate and 1 as infirm. And of the 1,599 total admitted into the Armagh Workhouse during 1842, 93% stayed less than 3 months. We need to remember these people were not forced in. They came in and out willingly, and if they wanted to leave, all they had to do was give the master notice of 3 months. But when they went, they had to take the whole family with them. And when they were in the workhouse, they weren't able to negotiate or communicate with the family. Remember, they were divided into male, female adults, and boys and girls. They never saw each other once they came in until they decided to go out again. But they were free to come and go as they wanted. But as long as they stayed in the workhouse, they had to obey the rules. So we obviously have, in the winter time, the numbers would go up, the numbers would go down. Now let's move on to the 1843 register. Remember, 1842, 93% stayed less than 3 months. Look at the 1843 register. A total of 809 less than the 1842. And you can see there, May, April, May and June, the numbers are going down. The weather getting better. Now let us analyse this year and see, do we get a pattern here. June and July, 159 people entered the workhouse. Of those, 27 were men, 54 were women, 78 were children. And of these 78 children, 16 were under 2, 62 were between 2 and 15 years, and of these, 24 were orphaned or deserted. And of the 27 men, 7 had no occupation, 8 were described as labourers, 4 servants, 4 weavers, 2 stonemasons, 1 shoemakers, and 1 framer for pictures, etc. Of the men, 60% were able-bodied, the same percentage as in January of the previous year. And of the 809 total for the year, 773 stayed less than 3 months, which is a good proportion of them there. Total for 1844 of 948 in the whole year. Now let's analyse and see if we can get a pattern here. And look at 1846, 1847. Now, the famine, look at the increase in numbers. So look at the 1844 register. Again, numbers 948 coming in there. And of the 396 for January to May inclusive, 123 were aged or infirm, 35 were children, 238 were able-bodied, 61%. And of the 948, 14% stayed less than 3 months. So you can see they could come and go as they wanted, and they used it, and the workhouse did save a lot of lives. But it wasn't like the Magdalen homes where they were forced in and forced to stay. These people could come and go, but they had to obey certain rules and live a very strict life while they were in. Let's move on now. The famine hits Ireland in late 1845, early 1846. And look at the numbers. This was when the workhouse came into its own. Remember, the workhouses were not built for the famine. But during the famine, they became a potato blight. Hit Ireland late 1845, early 1846. The same blight hit America and England, but had no effect whatsoever because America and England were not totally dependent on the potato, as was the case in Ireland. And I explained earlier on, at the beginning of this video, why Ireland was totally dependent on the potato. Because of the scourge of absentee landlords, all money being drained out of the country, and the scourge of subdivision, where the land was divided into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces down through the generations. So by the time 1845 came, you might have had as much as 20 families living off a quarter of an acre of land. And the only crop which will yield enough to support that kind of population was the lump of potato. So when the blight hit the potato, Ireland was devastated. And the irony is, at the same time as the Irish were starving, huge amounts of grain and corn were being shipped out of the country, exported for money. Look at 1846, 1847. 1846 famine. 2465 in the workhouse. You can clearly see there the numbers coming down June, July and August, and then soaring up again in the winter months. And the same for 1847. Look, 4590, the 2 worst years of famine. Look at the numbers here in the workhouse. A workhouse built for 1,000 inmates. Look at what we've got. There was nowhere else for them to go. And the fact that they could go in there, yes, it meant that they could survive. Because remember, the evictions going on in the rest of the country. If the poor farmers could not pay their rent, they were evicted. And the houses were, the wee cabins were burnt in front of them in case they went back in again. Where were those people to get the money? There was no money in the country. It was being taken out, all given over to England, to the absentee landlords. There was no money for them. So the only place they could go was the workers. And yes, the workhouse did save. So by 1848, famine, as in 1845 and 1846, was more or less eased off. So look at the numbers here. 1848, 3,100. 1849 down, 1850 down again, and by 1851 just down to 710. So it was during the famine years that the numbers were way over the top and the workhouse was overcrowded. That was the years when we had the cholera and the fever because of the overcrowding conditions. But by 1851 the numbers have gone down to 710. As you can see, there's a big drop here between 1850 and 1851. from 1,074 in 1850 to 710 in 1851. A big drop there. And this can be explained mostly by the 1851 Medical Charities Act, which provided the complete machinery for supplying domiciliary medical relief in all parts of the country. The workhouse had been for indoor relief, and now outdoor relief in their own homes was coming with that Medical Charities Act. Up until this, the sick had been able to obtain medical relief only in workhouse hospitals, in county infirmaries, and as outpatients in numerous dispensaries. But now they were able to get relief in their own homes. A big drop there in the 1851 numbers. Again, in the years 1879 to 1887, there was a sharp agricultural depression, and the government had to sanction outdoor relief to the able-bodied on a large scale again. They were not happy about it, and in December 1882, they tried to reassert the principle of no relief outside the workhouse. The principle of indoor relief on which the workhouse system had been established was undermined, and the idea of outdoor relief, at least in times of temporary depression, had been accepted. The 1906 Vice-Regal Commission recommended the workhouses be discontinued. And then in 1908, the Old Age Pensions Act was taken in, which provided outdoor relief. And in 1948, with the establishment of the welfare state, the workhouse system was abolished completely. Those buildings were made into dispensaries, and they later were made into hospitals. And simply because they were strong buildings built to last, and nearly every hospital in the country, the major ones, have been built out of the old workhouses. So look what happened here. The workhouses had been built for able-bodied people, and we saw how over 60% in the early years were able-bodied. But by 1905, there were 159 workhouses and 45,005 inmates. 1/3 of these were sick, nearly 1/3 aged and infirm, 1/12 were put down as insane or epileptic, 1/7 were children and mothers of illegitimate children. But the able-bodied amounted to only 30%. They had been grim, deterring structures, built to house for a temporary period able-bodied men and women, but at the same time to afford such harshness and rigidity that those seeking relief would do so only as the very last resort. Grim and all as the story may be, we must remember that the workhouses saved countless lives during the time of their existence, and especially in Ireland during the famine years. No person was physically forced into the workhouse. People could enter and leave freely at their own will. But while they were inside, the regime was austere, harsh and uncompromising. That was the whole purpose, to determine who really was destitute. And the figures from the register show that the winter months saw higher numbers enter the workhouse because, of course, of the harsh weather, and then numbers decreasing during the summer months. Armagh Workhouse, now Tariel Hospital, and still very much in part as it was in its early days, affords us a unique insight into many aspects of the Great Famine in Ireland. Its inside story shows us an attempt made in the latter half of the 19th century to deal with the growing problem of poverty and vagrancy in Ireland in general and in Armagh in particular. And now that we've looked at the workhouse and what is left of it here, and we've had an insight into the life of it, it's time for us to remember the paupers who died in the workhouse. And we're now going over to the paupers' graveyard, and we're going to do a cleansing of that graveyard and the land there. Because we must remember, these, mostly children, died in trauma and fear and terror. And the land soaks up that. And we're now going to do a clearing of that land. Right. you.